the image most people carry of the Pacific War is dominated by the immense American carrier task forces. Vast wooden-decked cities at sea absorbing blow after blow from kamikaze attacks. By the final year of the war, these suicide strikes had become one of Japan's most desperate and destructive tools, capable of ripping open hangar decks, igniting aviation fuel, and sinking or crippling major American vessels. Yet when the British Pacific Fleet arrived in 1945, operating alongside the U.S. Navy for the first time in the Pacific Theater, a striking pattern emerged. The same type of kamikaze aircraft that tore through American decks often failed to achieve the same result against British carriers. The disparity was so sharp that even American observers recorded their astonishment. Where a U.S. carrier might be out of action for days after a single hit, a British carrier was sometimes back to launching aircraft within the hour. To understand this contrast, it is necessary to examine not only the final months of the Pacific War but the long chain of decisions, technical, doctrinal, and philosophical, that shaped two very different carrier designs. The American Essex class and their predecessors were built around offensive striking power and large air groups. Their wooden flight decks, though reinforced underneath, were designed to maximize aircraft capacity and allow rapid wartime construction. British fleet carriers, by contrast, were designed in the late 1930s with European threats in mind, threats that included land-based bombers, armor-piercing ordnance, and the expectation of operating in narrower seas. As a result, British designers created carriers with armored flight decks, armored hangar sides, and compact internal layouts meant to withstand direct hits from high-explosive or semi-armor-piercing bombs. These design differences, originally intended for the Mediterranean, became decisive when Britain entered the kamikaze-intensive battles of 1945. When the British Pacific Fleet sailed against the Sakishima Gunto airfields and later supported operations near Okinawa, kamikaze pilots found a target they were not accustomed to, a carrier whose flight deck was effectively a thick steel shield, not a vulnerable wooden surface that could be punched through and set ablaze. But the story is not merely about armor. To understand why British carriers endured impacts that sank or disabled American ships, we must look deeper into operational doctrine, damage control philosophy, and the brutal learning curve created by years of fighting in the Mediterranean. The British Pacific Fleet entered the final phase of the war with a damage control culture shaped not by the Pacific, but by years of attrition in the Mediterranean, an environment where carriers faced sustained assaults from Luftwaffe dive bombers, Italian torpedo aircraft, and long-range land-based attacks. Ships like Illustrious, Indomitable, and Formidable had already survived armor-piercing bombs that might have destroyed lighter-decked carriers. These earlier experiences hardened not only British carrier design but the mindset of their crews, who developed a doctrine built on rapid containment of fire, aggressive sealing of compartments, and continuous training in compartmentalized damage control. By 1945, these methods were not theoretical procedures, they were muscle memory. American carriers, built around maximizing air power, prioritized large flight decks, high aircraft capacity, and rapid sortie generation. Their wooden decks allowed quick wartime production and easier repairs but created a crucial vulnerability during kamikaze attacks. When a suicide aircraft punched through, flaming debris, fuel, and munitions could cascade into the hangar deck. Fires spread faster, explosions were more devastating, and restoration often required extensive repairs. British carriers, on the other hand, used enclosed armored hangars with steel bulkheads that acted as firebreaks. Damage was contained upward on the flight deck, not downward into the heart of the ship. This contrast showed clearly during the British strikes on Sakishima Gunto in March and April 1945. Japanese pilots launched persistent waves of kamikaze aircraft against Task Force 57. Several British carriers, including Indefatigable and Formidable, absorbed direct hits that would have caused catastrophic structural damage to wooden-decked ships. Instead, the kamikaze aircraft shattered on impact against steel plating, igniting fires that burned hot but in confined spaces. The deck might buckle, plates might warp, but the ship's fighting capability remained intact. Damage control teams, already drilled to an almost mechanical rhythm, moved instantly. Fires were suppressed in minutes. Ruptured fuel lines were sealed. Flight deck fragments were cleared or welded flush to restore aircraft operations. The signature image of British carrier resilience emerged from these moments. Plumes of black smoke rising from an armored deck, followed shortly by the unmistakable roar of aircraft launching again. Yet armor and training alone do not fully explain why British carriers withstood blows that crippled their American counterparts. The deeper answer lies in the philosophy behind British naval aviation, a philosophy that treated the carrier not as a floating airbase, but as a warship expected to take hits and keep fighting. British naval architects of the late 1930s approached carrier design with a battleship-era mindset. A capital ship must survive direct attack, remain afloat, and continue to function under pressure. This philosophy produced the illustrious class carriers, ships whose armored flight decks were not merely protective layers but structural elements integrated into the hull. In practice, this meant that a destructive force impacting the deck did not easily penetrate into the hangar or machinery spaces. Even when the flight deck was gouged or warped, the core of the ship remained secure, and repairs could be localized rather than system-wide. By contrast, the U.S. Navy designed its carriers as floating airfields prioritizing offensive capability. Their doctrine emphasized massive air groups, rapid launch cycles, and the ability to project firepower across enormous distances. This required spacious hangars, lighter deck structures, and open internal layouts to maximize aircraft flow. The trade-off became sharply visible in 1944–45. A kamikaze strike that breached a wooden deck often ignited aviation fuel and ammunition stored below, producing chain reactions that disabled, or in some cases sank, American vessels such as USS Bunker Hill and USS Franklin. These ships suffered devastating casualties and long repair periods despite their robust damage control teams. Meanwhile, British carriers absorbed hits of comparable force with markedly different outcomes. When HMS Formidable was struck in May 1945, the Kamikaze's 550-pound bomb detonated on the armored deck instead of plunging inside the ship. The blast blew a hole in the steel plating and scattered flaming wreckage across the flight deck, but the ship's engines, hangars, and aviation fuel reserves remained untouched. Within hours, repair crews patched the deck sufficiently for aircraft to resume operations. The same pattern repeated with HMS Indefatigable, hit by a kamikaze whose wreckage skidded across the deck but failed to penetrate. Fires were contained, casualties were lower, and air operations resumed astonishingly quickly. This resilience had a psychological effect, not only on British crews who gained confidence in their vessels, but on American observers who witnessed firsthand how differently these ships responded under identical threats. U.S. officers noted the speed with which British carriers recovered from what appeared to be catastrophic strikes. In reports filed after joint operations, several American analysts admitted that the armored deck concept, though reducing aircraft capacity, offered undeniable advantages in the face of kamikaze-style attacks. But understanding endurance requires more than examining armor thickness or deck composition. The real turning point in the Pacific came when these design principles met an enemy determined to crash aircraft into the fleet, an enemy that soon learned that not all carriers reacted the same way to sacrifice. By the time the British Pacific Fleet joined operations off Okinawa, kamikaze strategy had evolved into a grimly efficient system. Pilots from Kyushu and Formosa launched in coordinated waves, exploiting gaps in radar coverage and attempting to overwhelm Allied combat air patrols. Their objective was brutally simple: crash directly into the largest, most valuable ships and ignite catastrophic fires. American carriers suffered heavily under these tactics. Wooden decks, saturated with aviation fuel residues and covered with parked aircraft during launch cycles, proved vulnerable to downward penetrating impacts. Even near misses could send flaming debris into the hangar deck, triggering cascading explosions that crippled flight operations. When these same kamikaze units attacked British carriers, they encountered a markedly different results profile. The British Pacific Fleet, Task Force 57, operated under strict flight deck discipline shaped by years of Mediterranean combat. British carriers typically maintained fewer aircraft parked on deck, and their enclosed armored hangars restricted the spread of fire. Even before the enemy struck, this posture reduced the potential damage surface. During the Okinawa operations, HMS Formidable suffered multiple direct hits. One of the most documented incidents occurred on May 4, 1945, when a kamikaze aircraft managed to break through the combat air patrol and slammed into the starboard side of Formidable's flight deck. The explosion tore open steel plating, hurled debris across the deck, and set several fires. Yet within minutes, damage control parties moved through the smoke with practiced precision, extinguishing flames, clearing wreckage, and beginning immediate repairs. American liaison officers aboard the British carriers expressed disbelief at how little internal damage had occurred. The armored deck absorbed the full force of the impact, preventing the blast from igniting fuel stores or detonating aircraft munitions below. Formidable's hangar, engines, and fuel lines remained secure. What looked from a distance like a fatal hit was, in structural terms, a localized wound serious but survivable. After temporary steel plates were welded in place, aircraft resumed operations far sooner than enemy observers believed possible. Similarly, HMS Indomitable and HMS Victorious endured kamikaze hits that left them scarred but operational. In each case, the impact pattern followed the same script. The aircraft exploded against the deck surface rather than penetrating it, fires remained topside, and the ship retained functional integrity. These events created a contrast that did not go unnoticed. Japanese reconnaissance units reported frustration that British carriers, unlike their American counterparts, rarely showed signs of being put permanently out of action. This created a shift in enemy expectations. Pilots who believed that crashing into a carrier would almost certainly disable it now faced the unsettling reality that the British ships could absorb sacrifice after sacrifice and continue fighting. That psychological impact would reveal itself more fully as the attacks continued into late May. As April turned to May 1945, the Japanese command recognized a troubling trend in their combat reports. Kamikaze missions against British carriers were achieving far fewer decisive results than similar strikes on American ships. Radio intercepts and post-war analyses confirmed that Japanese pilots noted the difference firsthand. Several crews reported that British carriers appeared to possess metal decks, or armored ceilings, that deflected the impact rather than allowing the aircraft to punch through. Although not all pilots survived long enough for detailed observations, a consistent thread emerged. Crashing into a British carrier did not guarantee the same destructive consequences. This shift in perception carried serious strategic implications. Kamikaze attacks were not merely tactical weapons. They were psychological tools designed to break Allied momentum by inflicting shocking, sudden losses. The shock value was greatly diminished when an attack produced fire and debris, but the ship sailed on, rebuilt its deck, and continued launching sorties within hours. Reports from American and British liaison officers described Japanese attempts to shift targeting priorities toward U.S. carriers, which were seen as more vulnerable to catastrophic damage. Task Force 57's operational durability essentially undermined a central pillar of Japan's late-war strategy: trading lives for major Allied assets. Another factor contributing to British resilience was the rigid compartmentalization of their carriers' internal architecture. Years of operating under high-threat conditions taught the Royal Navy to treat every compartment as a potential barrier against fire or flooding. Bulkheads were routinely closed during high-alert operations, smoke curtains deployed quickly, and repair parties pre-assigned specific zones long before contact with the enemy. This level of preparation limited secondary damage, one of the most lethal aspects of kamikaze strikes on American carriers. On Essex-class ships, a penetrating hit could trigger a cascade. Ruptured fuel lines, exploding ready-use ammunition, flaming aircraft remnants, and structural beams collapsing into the hangar. British ships, by comparison, contained the impact at the deck level, sparing lower compartments from compounding disasters. The cumulative effect of this resilience strengthened Allied operational tempo in the Okinawa area. While American carriers sometimes required withdrawal or extended repair periods after a severe kamikaze strike, the British Pacific Fleet maintained more consistent presence. This reliability made them a valuable complement to U.S. forces, enabling sustained pressure against Japanese airfields and reinforcing the perception that Britain's armored carriers were uniquely suited to absorb punishment in the suicide attack environment of 1945. But the fullest illustration of British endurance came in a single sequence of events, one that demonstrated beyond doubt how differently these ships responded when facing the deadliest strikes the Japanese could deliver. The clearest demonstration of the contrast between British and American carrier survivability occurred during the intense wave of kamikaze attacks in early May 1945. On May 9th, a Japanese aircraft managed to break through heavy interception and dove directly onto HMS Formidable. The impact created an eruption of flame and shrapnel, sending steel fragments across the deck and injuring dozens of crewmen. The force of the explosion buckled portions of the armored plating, creating a significant indentation nearly 10 feet wide. Flames raced across the starboard side, and smoke poured upward in a towering column visible across the task force. To outside observers, it appeared as if the ship had been struck a killing blow. But within minutes, formidable damage control teams were executing the procedures they had rehearsed repeatedly since the early years of the war. Fire curtains dropped into place. Hose teams advanced through the smoke with practiced coordination. Medical parties moved wounded crew below decks while engineering teams assessed structural strain on the flight deck. What might have developed into a catastrophic, hours-long inferno aboard a wooden-decked carrier was instead reduced to a controlled burn. The armored deck, though dented, remained unbreached. Hangar spaces were untouched, and the ship's machinery continued to operate normally. Temporary repairs began almost immediately. Steelworkers heated and hammered the warped plating, welding support braces and clearing debris with astonishing speed. Communications teams coordinated with escort vessels to maintain protective screens while the carrier restored functionality. In a moment that became emblematic of British carrier doctrine, Formidable resumed limited flight operations later the same day, first with reconnaissance aircraft, then with strike fighters. The visual of aircraft lifting off from a scarred, smoke-stained deck stunned American officers who witnessed it. Reports filed afterward described Formidable as fully combat effective despite heavy impact, a phrase rarely applied to American carriers hit under similar conditions. This single event, mirrored by similar episodes aboard Indefatigable, Indomitable, and Victorious, cemented the reputation of the British Pacific Fleet as uniquely resistant to kamikaze tactics. Japanese intelligence units, monitoring Allied movements, repeatedly noted that British carriers showed unusual durability and rapid recovery after attack. These understated assessments belied a strategic truth. The Royal Navy had built carriers not merely to project power but to survive the worst that modern aerial warfare could inflict. As the Okinawa campaign drew toward its conclusion, the endurance of Britain's armored carriers played a subtle but essential role. They helped maintain a continuous striking presence despite Japan's intensifying suicide attacks. They absorbed damage that might have sidelined other vessels. And they demonstrated that design philosophy, born from the confined, high-threat Mediterranean, could decisively influence outcomes in the vast Pacific. In the end, the British Pacific Fleet's ability to withstand kamikaze hits that sank or crippled American ships was not the result of a single advantage. It was the product of armored engineering, enclosed hangars, rigorous damage control culture, compact internal layouts, and a hard-earned understanding that a carrier was more than a floating airfield. It was a warship expected to take hits, stay afloat, and keep fighting. That combination allowed Britain's carriers to endure the final, desperate wrath of a dying empire and emerge from the Pacific War scarred, but unbroken.